There is a particular kind of arrogance that wears the shape of dignity. It stands straight. It addresses rooms rather than people. It moves through the world like weather, noticed by all, truly known by none. Dorian Eversley, 6th Duke of Thornwick, had lived inside that arrogance for 34 years and found it entirely sufficient, until the winter of 1813, when a woman he had refused to see twice became the only person capable of saving the name he had not bothered to speak aloud. She did not ask for his gratitude. He did not think to offer it. And for a time the world between them was made entirely of silences, each one heavier than the last, each one carrying the thing that neither of them would say first. This is a story about what pride costs, and what it costs to lay it down. London, November 1813. The fog comes off the Thames in long, cold fingers, reaching into every alley and lampless courtyard in the city. A young woman stands behind a long wooden counter in a small shop off Cheapside, her hands moving precisely over glass jars and paper packets, her storm blue eyes steady and unhurried. She has learned to exist quietly. She has learned, since her father's disgrace, that quiet is its own form of armor. She does not expect anything from this grey morning except more of the same. More silence, more work, more days passing like pages in a book no one is reading. She does not know that a carriage has just turned into the street below. Tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? The city, the hour. I read each one. The bell above the door made a thin, cold sound, the kind that expected to be ignored. Georgiana Cavendish did not look up immediately. She was measuring powdered bark of cinchona into a small brass scale, her breath held, her fingers still. 2 grains over, and the patient would vomit for a day. 2 grains under, and the fever would return by nightfall. Precision was not a preference in this work. It was the whole of the work. She finished the measurement, folded the paper packet with the neat economy of long practice, and then she looked up. 2 men stood just inside the door. One was thick-necked and red-faced, wearing the strained expression of a man who considered himself far too important to be in a place like this. She recognized him as Hargraves, steward to one of the Mayfair houses, a man who had been to the shop twice before, with lists that someone else had written. The other man she had never seen in person, though she knew who he was the moment her eyes reached his face. The Duke of Thornwick was difficult not to know, even without the carriage bearing his crest parked on the street outside. He was tall in the way that certain buildings are tall, not merely a matter of inches, but of presence, a density in the room that rearranged the air around it. Dark hair, threaded at the temples with silver, a jaw set as though it had been carved from something that did not accommodate negotiation. He wore a dark greatcoat, with the particular ease of a man for whom clothes are a formality easily discharged, and he stood just inside the door with both hands at his sides, and his gaze moving across the shop in the way a man's gaze moves across a landscape from a carriage window, assessing, categorizing, finding nothing worth slowing down for. Amber. His eyes were amber, the specific dark warm gold of leaves just past their turning, when autumn has committed to something. He did not look at her. Is the proprietor available? The question was addressed past her shoulder, directed at the middle distance of the shop, as though the shelves themselves had been the intended recipient. Mrs. Dunmore is presently visiting a patient in Holborn. Georgiana kept her voice even and informative. I assist her. What is needed? Hargraves stepped forward and produced a list, setting it on the counter with the manner of a man depositing something beneath his dignity. Beside it, he placed a folded paper, a prescription by the look of the wax seal. A 3-week supply, the physician's compound as specified. The Duke's regular apothecary is occupied and time is of importance. She unfolded the paper. She read it once. Then she read it again. The compound itself was standard. Willow bark, valerian tincture, a measured quantity of the compound powder she kept behind the counter. Standard, unremarkable, nothing to stop at. But the physician had added a footnote at the bottom in a hand that moved quickly and did not seem to have paused, to be combined with the patient's current evening preparation, Viennese formula for the nerves. She looked up. May I ask what preparation the Duke is currently taking in the evenings? Hargraves straightened. I beg your pardon. The evening preparation the physician mentions. She kept the question clinical, which it was. He's written this compound to work alongside something already in use. If I don't know what that is, I cannot confirm the proportions are without risk. Hargraves produced the expression of a man who had not come to a cheapside apothecary to be questioned by its counterstaff. Dr. Whitmore of Mayfair has prescribed this compound, and his credentials are... I am not questioning his credentials. She was, at least in part, but that was not what this was. I am asking a clinical question that his note does not answer. It will take you 30 seconds to answer it. A silence settled between them. In it, she heard a small movement from the direction of the door, cloth against the frame, a shift of weight, and for one suspended moment, she thought the Duke might speak. He did not. He was examining the window glass, or possibly what lay beyond it, Hargraves said with the compressed precision of a man exercising restraint. The preparation is private. Provide the compound as specified. She did not move. The valerian in the doses the physician had written, combined with a Viennese sedative preparation of the sort fashionable among men of quality since the wars, when sleep had become something you pursued rather than fell into, could, in certain constitutions, suppress the heart's rhythm, not all at once, gradually, the way a candle is suppressed under a glass. The flame persists for a while before it doesn't. She did not know which Viennese preparation. She did not know this man's constitution. She could not be certain. But she had her father's voice behind her eyes, calm and specific. When in doubt, say so. The patient's life is not your professional discomfort to protect against. I will fill the order, she said, but I would ask that someone advise the Duke to inquire with Dr. Whitmore whether these two preparations have been specifically reviewed together, the doses in particular. She kept her voice entirely without alarm. Alarm, with stewards, produced defensiveness rather than action. It is a routine question, one worth asking. Hargraves received this the way a man receives information he intends to discard. He collected the compound she had already prepared, which she had measured while talking. The hands did not need the mind for a preparation this straightforward. And he paid the amount she quoted and turned toward the door. The Duke had already moved to open it. She spoke not to him. She was not so impractical as to address a duke directly in these circumstances, but clearly enough to the room, to the air between them. 2 grains difference is all it takes, in either direction. The bell above the door rang its thin, insufficient ring. She stood looking at the closed door. The smell of turpentine and dried herbs and cold November air hung in the shop. She heard from outside the creak of harness leather and the particular sound of carriage wheels resolving into motion. She went back to her scale. She did not think she would see him again. 5 days passed. On the morning of the 6th, Hargraves returned alone. He came in without the carriage, on foot, arriving just as Georgiana was turning the sign on the door from closed to open. He stood in the threshold, looking at her with the expression of a man discharging an obligation that he found personally offensive, and he said with considerable effort, "The Duke is unwell." She stepped back to let him in and closed the door against the cold. "In what way?" The attending physicians, Dr. Whitmore's man and a second fellow sent for by Lord Beauchamp, have said it is a disruption of sleep, nothing consequential. He pressed his mouth together in a manner that suggested he had opinions about this characterization. He has been unwell since the 2nd day after the compound was begun. She had known this was coming. She had not known it would feel the way it did. A cold certainty sliding down between her shoulder blades, the particular discomfort of having been right about something she had wanted to be wrong about. "Is he still taking the evening preparation?" she said. Hargraves paused. He was a man who paused when questions required him to have paid attention, and the pause itself told her he had. "Yes." "At what hour?" "Before retiring. 10, generally." "And the compound?" "With supper, 6 o'clock. 4 hours apart. That might be sufficient interval in some constitutions for some preparations. She didn't know enough to know whether it was sufficient here. She knew that it might not be. The shop was quiet. Mrs. Dunmore was in the back, cataloguing a new delivery. Outside, the street was going about its grey November business. The smell of cold stone and horse dung, and, from somewhere farther, the particular sweetness of a bakery's early fire. "I cannot provide more of the compound without adjustment," she said. Hargraves made the face again. The physician's note did not answer my question when I asked it. The compound has been taken for 5 days, alongside an unspecified sedative, and the Duke is unwell." She turned to the shelf behind her, because the conversation was over in all the ways that mattered. "I will adjust the preparation. Give me a few minutes." She worked in silence, reduced the valerian by 1/3, added rosemary extract, a small quantity carefully measured, which she had seen her father use against the over-deep slowing of the heart in patients given too much of combined sedatives. It was not a correction, it was a hedge. It bought time and reduced risk while the physicians sorted out whatever they had prescribed without coordinating. She wrapped the packet and wrote a note in her smallest, clearest hand. "Take with supper at 6. Do not take within 5 hours of any sedative preparation. If patient experiences slow or irregular pulse, discontinue use immediately and summon a physician. This is not a recommendation. This is a condition of the preparation's safety." She folded the note inside the paper. She held the packet out to Hargraves, who took it. He looked at the edge of paper that protruded from the fold and did not take that. He left it on the counter. Whether he forgot or whether he intended to leave it, she did not determine in time. He was gone before she arrived at the question. She picked the note up, read it over. The words looked back at her with the flat, unhelpful precision of words that are correct and insufficient at the same time. She set it on the shelf behind the counter. 2 days later, she received a request to deliver Lady Alcott's monthly medicines to a house in Grosvenor Square, where a dinner of 40 was to take place that evening. She did not connect the two things until she was standing in the kitchen passage with her basket and heard the silence begin. Lord Alcott's house was lit up like a ship at sea. Every window blazed. Carriages stood 4 deep along the curb, their lanterns making small islands of yellow light in the November dark. A string quartet's sound reached even the servants' passage, where Georgiana waited with her basket, having delivered Lady Alcott's remedies to the housekeeper's girl, and now waiting for the payment receipt that was taking longer than it should. The kitchen was working at full capacity. Roast beef, burnt sugar, the high specific heat of a room feeding 40 at table, voices overlapping everywhere, no one looking at her. She had chosen the low stool near the passage door, the position that was invisible without being absent, and she sat in it and waited. The noise from the dining room reached her in waves, then a silence. Not the ordinary silence of a conversation dying between courses, the particular spreading silence of a room discovering that something has gone wrong, the moment before the voice, before the chair, before the commotion. She heard it and was on her feet before the first cry came. She moved through the passage door, through the wide service corridor, and stopped in the doorway of the dining room. 40 people stood at their chairs or were already clustering toward the far end of the table, where a man had slumped sideways in his seat and was being lowered, not gently, to the floor by 2 footmen who did not know what they were doing, but were doing it with great urgency. A woman in yellow silk had both hands pressed to her mouth. A gentleman in a red waistcoat was already shouting, "Physician, fetch the physician, someone must fetch the physician," in the way men shout things that someone else should be doing. She saw the face of the man on the floor. The basket was in her hand. She was moving before her mind had finished the thought. "Let me through." Not loud, not sharp. There is a tone, she had learned this from her father, that calm produces in a room full of panic. It is not the tone of authority. It is something quieter and more persuasive. The crowd parted. She knelt. His pulse when she found it at the wrist was present. She felt that first with a relief she did not let reach her face. But wrong. Too slow. Then suddenly faster, uneven, the rhythm of something trying to regulate itself and failing to find the pattern. His color was the grey-white of old candle tallow. His eyes were half open and moving without focus, the amber of them dulled to something flat and absent. She knew this, not from a textbook, though it was in the texts. From her father, from a case he had described to her 3 times, because he believed repetition made knowledge permanent. A man of 62, taking an Austrian sleep draught, given valerian by a well-meaning nurse who did not know about the draught. The heart's confusion when asked to slow by 2 different compounds at the same time, from 2 different directions. From her basket she took a small brown bottle. Camphor in spirit of wine. A stimulant. Careful, careful with it. Too much would create a different problem. She measured by eye the way she had been taught to measure by eye when time would not permit anything better. She loosened his cravat with one hand, one-handed, not thinking about it, fingers finding the knot by feel. A hand closed on her shoulder. "The physician has been—" "I know." She did not look up. "Stand back, please." She administered the camphor and set 2 fingers back on his wrist and counted. The room behind her was not quiet. There were voices, the occasional high sound of alarm, the sound of a woman weeping somewhere to her left. But she had stopped taking any of it in. Her father had called this the room within the room, the small interior space where only the clinical fact existed, where everything that was not the pulse had ceased to matter. She was in that room. The pulse. The question the pulse was asking, whether it would find its answer. 3 minutes. 4. His color began to change, the gray receding from his face, not gone, but receding, a faint underlying warmth returning to the surface. The pulse found a rhythm, still slow but continuous. Itself. She sat back on her heels and let her breath out through her nose. The physician arrived behind her, a young man in an impressive coat who had the expression of someone who had expected to be summoned for something less inconvenient than this. He knelt on the other side of the Duke and did what physicians do when they arrive after the crisis. He performed authority over the aftermath, adjusted the position, called for brandy, made several pronouncements in Latin that did not require a response. Georgiana stood up. She collected her basket from the floor where it had ended up. In the doorway she stopped and looked back once. The Duke's eyes had opened fully. He was looking at the ceiling, then at the physician's face above him, which he appeared to find uninspiring. Then, in the slight turn of his head, across the room toward the doorway, and for one moment she could not explain or prepare for, his gaze found hers. She stepped back into the corridor. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed that while she was working. She noticed it now and pressed them flat against the sides of her basket until the shaking stopped, which took until she had reached the street. She completed the transaction for Lady Alcott's remedies. She walked out into the cold. The fog had thickened since she had arrived, wrapping the squares and the street lamps in something muffled and imprecise. She turned her collar up and walked, and she thought about the pulse. Whether the camphor had been right, whether a different agent would have been faster, whether the note left on a counter had reached anyone who read it. She thought about these things all the way back to Southwark. She thought about the amber of his eyes briefly once, and then did not think about it again. In the corridor off the dining room, Lord Rafferty Beauchamp stood very still for a moment. He had watched a woman with dark hair and storm-blue eyes step back through a doorway and disappear. He filed this away with the careful attention of a man who has learned to notice the things that other people fail to. Dorian spent 2 days in bed. He had not spent 2 days in bed for illness since 1797, when he was 18, and a particularly efficient fever had kept him horizontal for the better part of a week. He had found it intolerable then. He found it more intolerable now, partly because he was older, and the tolerance for intolerable things decreases with age, and partly because there was a specific restless quality to this recovery that had nothing to do with his health. Beauchamp came on the second afternoon. He sat in the chair by the window and ate an apple from the bowl on the side table with the specific ease of a man who has been friends with you long enough to find your suffering mildly entertaining. He said, "You nearly died at dinner, which I must say is an unusual approach to leaving early." Dorian looked at the ceiling. The plasterwork there was very fine. His mother had commissioned it from a craftsman who understood that ceilings should reward the kind of sustained attention that the horizontal ill end up giving them. He had examined it many times over the years. He was examining it now and thinking about hands. "Whitmore's man says it was an irregular cardiac episode," Beauchamp continued. "He used a great many Latin words that I found less informative than I believe he intended them to be. His diagnosis is not what concerns me." "No." Beauchamp looked at him. "It isn't." A silence that had the quality of something being approached. "There was a woman," Dorian said. "Yes," said Beauchamp, who had evidently been waiting for this with some patience. "Dark hair, she was not a guest." He considered the ceiling. "She was not a servant either, I think. She moved differently. She had a basket, medicines or something of that kind." "Yes." Beauchamp turned the apple in his hand. "I asked around after. No one among the staff could agree on who she was. One said she was from the kitchens, one said she was from an apothecary." He paused, examining the apple. "She had very efficient hands. I noticed them from across the room." Dorian had noticed the same thing. He had also noticed, over the 2 days he had spent looking at plasterwork, that he had seen those hands before. Or rather, been in the same room as those hands before, and had chosen not to look at them. Had addressed the wall past her shoulder, had listened to his steward dismiss her question, had walked out of a shop in Cheapside and been vaguely aware as he went that she had said something to the air behind him about 2 grains difference. He looked at the ceiling and felt with uncomfortable specificity what sort of man he had been in that shop. "The apothecary on Cheapside," he said. "Dunmore's. A Mrs. Dunmore runs it. She has an assistant, apparently. Young woman, keeps to herself." Beauchamp bit the apple, chewed. "I don't know her name." He didn't know it either. He was aware, with a discomfort he did not examine directly, that he had been in the same room as her twice and had not thought to ask. "Send Hargraves to the shop in the morning," he said. "Have him ask." Hargraves went. He returned with a name, Georgiana Cavendish, and a description that matched what Dorian remembered of the figure in the doorway, which was less than he wanted it to be, and more than he had expected. He returned also with the information that Miss Cavendish had not been at the shop when he arrived, and would be back by 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, Dorian was in his library, deciding not to go. He had a number of reasonable arguments for not going. He was recently recovered. The shop was in Cheapside. He had already sent his steward. She had saved his life, which was a fact, and facts could be addressed through the correct channels: a note, an arrangement, a donation to some appropriate charitable concern in her name. He did not need to go himself. At 5 minutes past 4, he put on his coat. She was not there. The proprietor, small with the watchful eyes of a woman who has spent decades determining which questions to answer, told him that Miss Cavendish had been delayed on a delivery, and would he like to wait? He said no. He said he would return. He stood for a moment on the Cheapside pavement in the cold and the particular noise of late afternoon, and then walked back around the corner to where his carriage was waiting. He sat in the carriage and looked at the street through the window, and thought about the specific feeling of having been in the wrong, which was not a feeling he had a great deal of practice with. Georgiana's lodgings were 2 rooms above a glover's shop in Southwark, reached by a narrow stair that smelled of leather and beeswax. She had made them careful. That was the word she used to herself. Not comfortable, not furnished, not decorated. Careful, the ordering of small spaces being the form of control most reliably available to her, and she had learned, in the 3 years since her father's death, to value reliable forms of control above all other kinds. Her father's medical books stood on a shelf above the window. Culpeper, Harvey, a battered copy of Hunter's Treatise, a German text on botanical compounds that she had taught herself to read, slowly, through 2 winters, using a dictionary she had bought for 6pence at a stall in Borough Market. His notebooks, 7 of them bound in green leather, his handwriting dense and looping and full of the private abbreviations of a man whose mind moved faster than his hand, were in the locked drawer of her desk. She lit the lamp and sat down. Outside, the city continued its ordinary evening, the sound of a cart on wet cobblestones, a dog's brief grievance, a woman calling something down to the street that received no answer, the smell of tallow from the lamp, the smell of old paper and dried lavender from the shelf above the window. On the desk beside the lamp was a letter. She had received it 8 days ago. She had read it 5 times. Each time she read it, the same thing happened in her chest, a tightening, and then a settling into cold, practical stillness, the part of herself that had learned to refuse fear until she had something actionable to do with it. The letter was from Mr. Aldous Pemberton, solicitor, acting on behalf of the estate of Sir Gideon Threlkny, her father's principal creditor, who had died 2 years ago. The debt was real. Her father had borrowed £2,000 from Threlkny when his practice collapsed, a polite word for what had happened, which was that a rival had made specific accusations in specific rooms, and the families of quality had stopped coming, and the families of the middle sort had followed, and then there had been no practice and no income and no way forward except the research. He had used the money to continue the research. He had died before he could repay it. She had been paying it, slowly and steadily at the rate she could manage. What she had not known was that Pemberton had discovered the other thing, the neighborhood work, the families in the streets around Southwark who came to her door when a physician was too expensive or too frightening or simply too far. She charged almost nothing. She refused no one. She had always been careful, described herself as knowledgeable in herbal preparations and traditional remedies, never claimed to be a physician, never used the language that would bring official attention. She had been careful for 3 years, and she had not been careful enough. Pemberton's letter made an offer. The debt, the whole of it, forgiven, in exchange for the green notebooks in the locked drawer. Her father's research. 15 years of work on wound fever, on septic infection, on the thing that killed more men in the aftermath of surgery than the surgery itself. Work that Pemberton's client, unnamed though she had her suspicions, had apparently learned of and considered valuable. If she refused, Pemberton would inform the magistrate of her unlicensed practice. The consequences for a woman without a great house to shelter her were, he noted, significant. She had 6 days remaining. She read the letter again. Then she set it face down on the desk and went to make tea, because the only sensible response to being cornered was to be warm while you thought. She stood at the small hearth and listened to the water in the pot, and thought about her father's voice. The specific one, the late afternoon voice he used when he was teaching her something he considered important. These notebooks are not mine, Georgiana. They belong to whoever uses them to help someone. That is the only ownership that matters. She understood what he had meant. She also knew that he had not meant Aldous Pemberton. She would not give them up. She could not give them up. That was not a decision she had made in the last 8 days. It was something settled in her a long time ago, before she had known there was a decision to make. What she had not yet settled was what she was going to do instead. She had been turning this over in her mind for days, examining it the way she examined a preparation, looking for the variable she had not yet accounted for, the factor that changed the equation. She had 4 possible directions. She was not yet certain which of them could bear any weight. The tea was ready. She poured it, sat down, and looked at the locked drawer. Whatever she was going to do, she had 6 days to do it. He came on a Wednesday. She knew before she looked up. There was a quality to the stillness his presence produced that she was apparently going to recognize now, the way the room's cold air moved differently, the particular weight that entered the space before any other signal did. The bell above the door, the footsteps measured and unhurried, the specific alteration in the light when something larger than ordinary stood between the windows and the shelves. She was checking an inventory list and she finished the line she was on. He was alone. No steward. No carriage that she could see from the corner of the window. A man of his position arriving alone at a cheapside apothecary on a Wednesday afternoon was a man who had decided to do something and had found the various reasons for not doing it insufficient. He stood at the counter. For a moment, something crossed his face that she would not have expected. A man of 34 who had spent all 34 years being looked at, by rooms, by staff, by the architecture of every situation he entered, did not ordinarily look uncertain. But there was a fraction of a second in which the Duke of Thornwick stood at her counter and appeared to be choosing between several things he did not know how to say. It passed. "I understand," he said, "that I am in your debt." The words were formal, considered. She heard in them the effort of a man who had rehearsed something and found, in the moment of saying it, that the rehearsal had made it smaller than he intended. She looked at him without filling the silence. He looked back. His amber eyes in the grey winter light of the shop were warmer than she remembered, the brown gold of them, with something underneath it, something that burned at a low temperature. She did not help him along. "You don't owe me anything," she said, and because she believed in exact language, "What I did was a matter of competence and a matter of being present. I would have done the same for anyone." Something moved in his expression. She wasn't certain what. "The warning," he said, "when you were last here. It was ignored." "Yes." A pause. "It might have been useful if someone had insisted." "It might have been," she said. "It was not my place to insist, and I was aware of that. And the modification to the compound, the one Hargraves brought on the second visit." She said, "Yes, that was mine." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jars behind her, the long row of them, the labels in her own careful hand. She wondered briefly if he was capable of reading this space, seeing it as something more than a backdrop. Most men in his position looked at shops the way they looked at kitchens, as places where necessary things originated, requiring no further attention. "What is your name?" he said. She looked at him. He was asking it the way a man asks something that he knows he should have asked sooner, and is not certain how to acknowledge that he knows this. She held his gaze for a moment, the amber of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he was standing slightly more still than a man ordinarily stands when he is waiting for an answer. "Georgiana Cavendish," she said. He said nothing immediately. She saw it, the slight change in his attention at the name, a recognition. She didn't know what he knew about Cavendish. She didn't ask. "Miss Cavendish," he said it as though storing it somewhere specific, as though it were a word he intended to find again. "Thank you." She inclined her head, the way she inclined her head at the conclusion of a transaction. He turned. He had almost reached the door when he stopped and said, without turning back to look at her, "The note that Hargraves left on the counter." She waited. "He told me about it," Dorian said, "later, when I asked." A silence. She said nothing, because she had not yet determined what he was asking her to receive. He said, "I should like to tell you that it was not representative of—" He stopped, tried again. "The oversight was mine, not his." He left before she could respond to that. The door swung shut. The bell rang. Georgiana stood for a moment looking at the closed door, and then looked down at the inventory list and found the line she had been on when he arrived, and could not, for the span of several seconds, remember what she had been verifying. Mrs. Dunmore came through from the back room and said nothing at all, which told Georgiana, among other things, that she had been listening. Beauchamp was watching him over a glass of port, in a way that Dorian found increasingly difficult to ignore. They were in the library. The fire had been going since 6. The clock on the mantelpiece had just announced 9. Beauchamp had said very little for the past 20 minutes, and was using the silence with the specific expertise of a man who knew that silence, in the right company, worked like a very patient form of pressure. "You went to the shop," Beauchamp said. "I had questions about my medication. Alone. I sometimes prefer—" "You never go anywhere without half your household, Dorian. You have a steward and a secretary and a footman, and generally a carriage, which serves as a movable stage for the performance of importance." Beauchamp considered his port with an expression of satisfaction. "You went alone, to Cheapside, on a Wednesday afternoon." Dorian said nothing. "What did you say to her?" "I thanked her." "Was that all?" It was not all. He knew it was not all, and he knew that Beauchamp knew it was not all, and he found himself in the familiar situation of information being available to both of them, while only one of them appeared to have any interest in avoiding it. "She said her name," he said. Beauchamp looked at him. "Cavendish," Dorian said. The look sharpened. Beauchamp set his glass down. "Marcus Cavendish's daughter." "Almost certainly." "The physician who was struck from the register in 1808. "Yes." Dorian moved to the window. The street below was quiet in the way streets are quiet late on weeknights, not empty, but reduced to its essential traffic. The case against him was made by a Dr. Reginald Hurst, who had applied for the same chair at the college that Marcus Cavendish was appointed to the year before, and who held the chair within 6 months of the accusation being lodged. He paused. The patient who died had been under surgery for a tumor. The surgery was complex and the outcome was not certain regardless of who performed it. Hurst's testimony was the primary evidence against Cavendish. There were no other physicians who corroborated it. Beauchamp was very still. "I knew some of this," he said. "There were people who didn't believe it, but no one sufficiently placed was willing to say so formally. Cavendish had no one." He looked into the fire. "I didn't know he had a daughter." "She is running a shop in Cheapside," said Dorian, Because she has her father's training and her father's disgrace, and the two together make everything between nearly impossible. He was still looking at the street. She is also in trouble. He said it the way he would say a fact, which it was. Beauchamp looked at him carefully. I've been making some inquiries after you went to the shop. He said this without apology, which was the form of honesty Dorian found least aggravating in him. A solicitor named Pemberton has been making inquiries about her activities in the neighborhood around Southwark. She practices medicine. She helps people who would otherwise have no one. Beauchamp corrected the framing with the precision of a man who considered framing important. Without formal credentials, which she cannot obtain, being who and what she is. Pemberton has found out. He represents a creditor of her father's estate. The offer he's made her is the debt forgiven in exchange for her father's research notebooks. Dorian turned. She refused, said Beauchamp. Of course she refused. A silence in which the fire settled. If she refuses, Beauchamp said, Pemberton goes to the magistrate. Unlicensed practice. For a woman without a great name behind her, the consequences are... He stopped, started again. Significant. When? Said Dorian. He gave her 14 days, as of 8 days ago. 6 days then. 6 days for a woman to be made to answer for the crime of having her father's education and her father's care for the poor and none of her father's institutional protection. Dorian stood at the window for a while. He was thinking about a note left on a counter, about a steward who had not been corrected in time, about a dining room floor and the particular quality of hands that know what they are doing, about the word Cavendish said in a Cheapside apothecary, and what it meant that the name had landed in him the way it had. He was not a sentimental man. He had no facility for the language of transformation, and he distrusted it in others. He believed in the weight of a debt and the dishonor of leaving one unaddressed. He believed in those things with the clarity of a man who had built a large part of his character on them. He said, "He has not yet gone to the magistrate." "No," said Beauchamp, "not yet." "Then we have time." He moved away from the window. "I need to know everything Pemberton has filed, everything he intends to file, and I need someone who knows the Cavendish case, the original one, well enough to speak to it formally." Beauchamp was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "What are you going to do?" he said. Not a challenge. Something more complicated than a challenge. Something that was also underneath. Something like hope. "What I should have done," said Dorian, "considerably earlier." He said it simply, without drama, as a man states a correction. That was all it was. He was not certain yet what it would cost him, his pride, his position, some amount of the careful armor he had spent 34 years not examining. He was aware, with a calmness that surprised him, that he did not particularly care. She had not expected it to go this way. The version she had rehearsed at her desk in the small hours, the version she had been living in for 3 days, since the morning Pemberton's final note arrived confirming the magistrate appointment, was a version in which she went alone. She stood in the waiting room among men who looked through her. She said what she needed to say in a language that the system recognized and the system responded to as it generally responded to women without names behind them, politely and with no effect. She had been preparing herself for that version with the specific internal discipline she had developed over 3 years of being someone the world arranged itself to overlook. She had not been preparing herself for the alternative. She came up the steps of the Bow Street office in the early grey of a November morning and found the Duke of Thornwick already in the corridor. He was standing with the straightness of a man for whom straightness is not effort, but constitution, in a dark coat, no hat. Lord Beauchamp stood slightly to his right. A third man was behind them, a solicitor by the papers under his arm, who looked at her with the careful expression of someone who has been briefed. On the other side of the corridor, Pemberton had just arrived, and the confidence that had entered the building with him was already recalibrating. Dorian looked at her when she came in. She looked back. She had looked at him in the shop and in the dining room doorway, and across a counter with a brass scale between them, and each time it had produced a different thing. This time, in this cold grey corridor, with what was about to happen arranged around them both, what his gaze produced was something she had not expected. Not warmth, not reassurance. Something older and more structural than either. The feeling of ground under uncertain footing. The feeling of something solid that had been there for a while without her knowing to stand on it. "Miss Cavendish," he said. "Your Grace." She looked briefly at Pemberton, who was straightening his papers with the particular energy of a man who is performing calm. Then back at Dorian. "You didn't tell me you intended to come." "No," he said. "I didn't." She understood from this that he had considered telling her and had decided against it. That he had predicted, correctly, that she would tell him it wasn't necessary. The magistrate's clerk, a thin man named Sowerby, who had the perpetually startled expression of someone who had organized his professional life around its being quieter than this, arranged them all into his office with the efficiency of a man making room for too many. He said he would hear the matter informally. He said this with the tone of a man hoping for it. Pemberton spoke first. He was capable. She had to acknowledge that. He laid the case out with economy and without embellishment. The debt documented. The unlicensed practice documented by 3 statements from neighbors. The law, specific and applicable. He was precise and professional, and what he was saying was true, in the way that a partial picture is true, and she sat and listened and prepared herself for what came next. Then Dorian spoke. He did not stand. He was already standing. He did not raise his voice because men who have been listened to their entire lives have no need to raise their voices to be heard. He stated, in the flat, factual tone of a man reading from an internal ledger that has been checked and rechecked, that he had visited Dunmore's apothecary on the 8th of November, and that Miss Cavendish had identified a dangerous interaction between his prescribed medication and his existing treatment, that she had warned his steward, that the warning had not been relayed, that on the 14th of November at Lord Alcott's house in Grosvenor Square, he had suffered a medical crisis directly attributable to that interaction, that Miss Cavendish had been present at the dinner and had administered emergency treatment without hesitation, with the competence and precision of a trained physician, while the attending doctor was still on his way up the stairs. He said that he was acquainted, through recent and prior knowledge, with the circumstances of Dr. Marcus Cavendish's professional disgrace, and considered the case to have been the product of deliberate professional malice rather than clinical error, a position he was prepared to advance through appropriate formal channels. He said that the claim against the notebooks of a physician whose name had been deliberately destroyed was a claim he considered improper and which he intended to contest. Then he paused. He turned and looked at her. Not at the clerk, not at Pemberton, not at the wall past her shoulder. At her. "The unlicensed practice," he said, and his voice had changed, fractionally, in the way voices change when they shift from argument to something else, "of a woman who received the full medical education of a physician, who has been denied formal credentials by convention rather than by deficiency of knowledge, who has been providing care to people who would otherwise have no access to it, who saved my life in a dining room in Grosvenor Square with the speed and certainty of a trained practitioner." He stopped. He let the sentence find its own conclusion. "I intend to appoint Miss Cavendish as medical advisor to my household. She will be formally and publicly employed under my name in that capacity, which resolves the question of credentials and removes the basis of this complaint." The room was quiet in the way of rooms that have just heard something they did not expect. Sowerby was writing. His pen made the small, decisive sounds of official recording. Pemberton said, with the reduced certainty of a man recalculating, "The unlicensed practice remains a matter of—" "It remains a matter for the household physician to determine," said Dorian. "Once Miss Cavendish is appointed to that household's medical staff, which she will be as of this morning. If you have a legal argument against that, I would be interested to hear it. My solicitor is also interested to hear it. The man behind Dorian with the papers had, she noticed, the expression of a solicitor who is being used as a prop and finding the experience entirely satisfactory." Pemberton looked at his documents. He looked at Sowerby's pen. He looked at the specific configuration of power in the room, and he did what intelligent men do when they have correctly identified a lost position. He gathered his papers and left without a formal statement, which was itself a formal statement. Sowerby finished writing. He made a brief murmured remark to Beauchamp. Then he looked at Georgiana and said with a kind of gentle exhaustion that he saw no further basis to proceed. He offered her a copy of the notes for her own record. She thanked him and took them. In the corridor outside the office, she stopped. The grey morning light came in through a high window above the stairwell. She could hear the street below, the ordinary London morning, entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a small room upstairs. She stood in the light with the clerk's notes folded in her hands and looked at the wall and waited for the feeling that was moving through her to settle into something she could name. Dorian had stopped a few feet ahead of her. He turned back. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from the dining room floor. Not the swept gaze from the apothecary, not the careful examination from across the counter. This was the look with the dust knocked off it, the one that had not had time to prepare itself. "You did not need to do that," she said. "Perhaps not. The appointment is real. If you find the terms unacceptable, we will discuss it. But it was the fastest available solution, and I preferred it to the alternative." He paused. "The debt has been settled separately." She looked at him. "You settled it." It was not a large sum. He said this in the tone people use when they are trying to make something uncomplicated, that the other person is making complicated, and she understood that the impulse was genuine and that he would find it genuinely bewildering if she spent time on gratitude. "My father's notebooks," she said. "They stay with me. They were always going to stay with you." He said it simply, as though this were a fact that had never been in question. "They're his. They're yours." Something caught in her throat. She did not let it reach her face. She looked at him for a moment, at the amber of his eyes in the grey corridor light, at the line of his jaw, at the silver in his hair, and the stillness of him, the genuine, unperformed stillness of a man who had nothing left to perform. She thought about a shop in Cheapside, and a note on a counter, and a warning to an empty room. She thought about how long it had taken him to come to the shop, how long it had taken her to understand why. "Georgiana," he said. "Not Miss Cavendish." Her name, said once, in the cold corridor, without formal preface or social scaffolding. Just the name, in his voice, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to say something and is saying it exactly as he decided to. She said, "Dorian." It came out steady, which surprised her. She felt something shift in her chest, not collapse but change, the way a weight shifts when you have been holding it so long that the adjustment is almost imperceptible until it isn't. She had been carrying so many careful distances, she had not known until one of them altered how many there were. He offered his arm. The gesture was formal. The gesture was also something other than formal. She could feel the difference in it without being able to say where the difference lived. After a moment, she took it. They walked out of the building and into the November street. The fog that had been a constant presence since October had cleared overnight, in the way London's fog sometimes did without warning, the city choosing suddenly to be transparent. She could see across the square. She could see the long, cold blue of the sky above the rooftops. She walked beside him with her hand on his arm, and the clerk's notes folded against her side, and the morning light fell on the cobblestones without apology, and the city went on being the city, and something that had been very tight for a very long time was, very quietly, beginning to ease. 3 weeks later, in the library of Thornwick House, the Duke of Thornwick sat at his writing desk and picked up a pen. He had said a great deal in those 3 weeks. He had spoken to a physician's board, and to a solicitor, and to a man at the college who had known Marcus Cavendish's work and considered it worth knowing. He had arranged for the notebooks to be properly catalogued, with Georgiana's involvement, at the rate she determined and in the manner she determined, because they were hers, and because this seemed like the only appropriate position. He had had 7 conversations with her in the capacity of her new employment, each of which had been professional and correct, and had lasted longer than strictly necessary, and during each of which he had been aware, with increasing clarity, that there was something he had not yet said, and that the not saying of it was beginning to constitute a kind of dishonesty. He was not a man who dealt well with dishonesty, in himself particularly. He picked up the pen and wrote, "Miss Cavendish, I am aware that it is somewhat irregular to write to one's household medical adviser on a subject that is not medical. I have been told occasionally that irregularity is a form of courage. I am not certain I accept that. I accept, however, that there are things I should have said directly and have not, because saying them requires a form of clarity that has been, until recently, beyond me. You warned me, and I did not listen. You helped me at a cost to yourself, when I had given you no particular reason to, and when I had done a great deal to suggest I was not worth the effort. You stood in a corridor and said my name in a manner I found unexpectedly significant, and have been finding significant since, at intervals throughout the ordinary business of the day. I find, Miss Cavendish, that I think of November as having two distinct halves now. The half before I learned your name and the half after. The first half is not something I intend to return to. I do not know precisely what to do with this. I suspect you know what to do with most things better than I do, and that this is not, in all honesty, an exception. I am asking, in the most formal possible terms, for the opportunity to find out. Yours with something I'm in the process of learning to name, D. Eversley. The letter sat on the desk for a time. Outside, London went about its November business, a carriage on the street below, the fire settling, the clock on the mantelpiece marking the quarter hour with a sound that asked nothing of anyone. He folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it in his own hand, in full, Miss Georgiana Cavendish. And then, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did something without first calculating what it would cost him. He sent it. The shadows where romance lives.